Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is going to be the confrontation and violence yesterday in front of the parliament. The second one is going to be an update on the case against former economics minister Vahan Kerobyan. And we're going to close with the latest Azeri demands for Armenia to change her constitution. Yesterday, we had significant confrontations in front of the Armenian parliament. Let's look over the steps that led to it. A few days ago, Bahan announced a continued 96-hour campaign to force the prime minister to resign. Obviously, the prime minister and his government did not respond to his ultimatum. There's been low-level but consistent protest all week. Primary street leading to the parliament and the prime minister's house has been closed by the police and protesters. It's been a small but consistent group of people that have stayed by the prime minister's house, holding vigils there all day. There's been an absurdly large police presence everywhere. In some cases, actually, you'll see more police than you see protesters. This led to this gigantic war of words in the parliament itself, mostly yesterday between the prime minister and the opposition. Prime minister made some accusations about how the protesters are paid to show up. They're paid 5,000 drams to show up and protest. Frankly, he used language that was unbecoming of his office as far as it was sort of barroom political language in describing the opposition, and the opposition was not much better than him. All of this crescendoed yesterday afternoon when about 2,000 or 3,000 of the Sarpazan supporters had gathered in front of the parliament, and they tried to break into the parliament, which led the police to use stun grenades to disperse the crowd. Now, the explosions were extremely loud. I think I've heard 7 or 8 explosions myself. You could have been a kilometer or two away and you could still hear it. This led to injuries among protesters. There are reports and videos of bottles being thrown at the police before and during the melee. And frankly, if you've been here, none of this is really surprising given the rhetoric that's been going on, especially from the protesters' side. But both sides have been using language that is not becoming of a normal democratic political system. I think tactically, what happened yesterday makes complete sense from the side of the Bagrat movement or his organization, political setup that he has, because frankly, the protests were dwindling down to a few hundred people a day. And in any kind of a confrontation, the protesters win. And obviously, this is what they got, because whenever you force the state to react or overreact, that's going to bring out more people and keep your fight going. Let's move on to the second topic of the week, which is an update on the case against former economics minister Vahan Kerobyan. Mr. Kerobyan was economics minister from right after the war until about a couple of months ago. He was one of our hyperactive ministers. He brought in a lot of quality people around him. And it was actually during his time that we had substantial economic growth. Obviously, it's not all credited to him, but it's, when you're there, you get the credit for anything good that happens in the same way that you get the blame when bad things happen. A couple of months ago, there were allegations against him, which led to his dismissal, that he had actually rigged a bid on a $1 million state contract. This week, the most damaging of those charges were actually dropped by the prosecutors, the one that involved public damage to the state, which is essentially the part that means that you did financial damage to the state. That indictment was removed. What this likely means is that most of the other charges are essentially not relevant, and the entire case is falling apart. In trying to analyze this, and we have to be very careful here, because I don't have any particularly confirmed information. Most likely, what Mr. Kerobyan was actually guilty of is trying to expedite the incomprehensible bidding process on state contracts on behalf of the most competent bidder. The procurement process in Armenia is Byzantine. It's actually designed in a way to actually get people into trouble at the best of times. In fact, this week, the Armenian government actually asked the United States to help setting up a new procurement process that is simpler and more transparent. In real terms, what Mr. Kerobyan is actually likely guilty of is actually doing his work, asking the wrong questions, and being too politically ambitious. Our political system is naturally set up to cut down its tall trees and to keep all the monkeys, and Mr. Kerobyan was one of our tallest trees. Now we're going to move on to our last topic of the week, which is the recent demands by the Azeri foreign minister for Armenia to change its constitution again. to sign any kind of a peace agreement. This is their latest demand. This comes a week after all of this pronunciations from the state that COP29 at the end of this year is going to be about peace and not just about the environment. And this, what they're actually referring to is in the Armenian preamble of the Armenian constitution, there's a reference about Artsakh. They want that removed, obviously. That's what their latest excuse is. The Armenian Foreign Ministry actually responded in very strong terms, which I appreciate, saying that this is essentially nonsense, that this is not an obstacle to peace, and no other country can demand us to change our constitution. What does this tell us? First and foremost, that this entire process is frankly a farce at this point. They will come up with reason after reason not to sign a peace treaty. And the why, we already know, and we've talked about it countless times, but if you're going to describe it in one sentence, is the regime in Baku dies without an Armenian enemy, and if you sign a peace treaty, then it's much harder to make the case you have an Armenian enemy. I think there's a few things that we need to understand from our end. That no peace treaty is likely to be signed. No transportation corridors are going to be opened in any direction. The border with Turkey is going to stay closed until there's regime change in Ankara or Baku. And we are at best entering a period of a cold peace. Analyzing all of this, frankly, is fine. What I mean by not signing a peace treaty, as long as there's no war or aggression, which in reality, the only thing that can deter that anyway is our strength and our upgrading our defenses. It has nothing to do with any piece of paper signed anywhere. For those who argue that a signed peace treaty will bring us peace and deter aggression, I would say that there's nothing in history that indicates that when you're dealing with a regime like the one we're dealing with in Baku, any kind of a signed agreement is actually worth anything. If you don't believe me, go ask the Greek Cypriots. There's no more defined border than an island, and their island, a good part of it has been occupied by the Turkish state for more than 50 years, while they're actually an EU country, and no one has said or done anything about it. And I think this is the one thing that people don't want to admit, but any kind of a signed peace agreement at this point, actually, it gives our stamp of approval to the events of last year, essentially our official state approval to the second Armenian genocide that the Azeri regime carried out in September and October of last year. If we sign a peace treaty of any kind at this point, frankly, we will regret it in 10 years. And in 10 years' time, our enemies will regret not signing it at this moment. From a more long-term and global perspective, I don't blame this government at all for pursuing peace. And I don't even blame them for keeping this farce going that we have in this back and forth process. They are dealing with objective realities, and frankly, they're actually buying time until we are better prepared to defend ourselves. Obviously, we're not for peace at any price, which sometimes seems to be the case. This is also the right spin to the world, which is that our side wants peace and our enemies do not. However, this approach and this farce that we have actually leads to two specific problems. One, which is the one I care about the most, is that they're not being honest with the Armenian people about the realities of what we are facing and what kind of an enemy we're dealing with, or neighbor in this case. Let's go through them. First and foremost, people need to understand that we have an existential enemy. And we need to psychologically prepare for people for essentially 2 decades of political, military, economic, and cultural struggle against them. We are dealing with an enemy that is culturally incapable of what I call the peace of equals. They understand two variables, one in which their whip's hand is over your head, or your whip's hand is over their head. And by the way, when our whip's hand was over their head, we had peace for more than 2 decades. What we are involved with here is a zero-sum game. Our security is dependent on, most importantly, our strength, and as importantly, on their systematic criminalization, delegitimization, and marginalization. Forget about win-win scenarios. Save those for our civilized neighbors. The second problem with this farce of this negotiation process is actually preventing us into engaging in what I call lawfare, which is the legal version of warfare. Since the argument is that any widening of bringing criminal charges against the criminal regime in Baku, like in the ICC, or to use the mercenary statutes that they obviously, when they laundered mercenaries from Turkey to fight in the war against Artsakh and Armenia, will prevent the signing of this mythical peace agreement. Lawfare in its full spectrum is actually one of our primary legal tools and is what the regime in Baku fears the most. Lawfare in this case against the regime will actually not lead to aggression, but most likely it would make it far less likely, because they would always have to be worried after the charges have been made that any aggression will lead to criminalization of the regime. What the regime fears most is the criminalization of itself, delegitimization, and if that's the case, that's the front that we need to double down on. In conclusion, I wanted to close with some comments about the happenings of yesterday in front of the parliament. There's an old saying about the words we use is the house we live in, and all of this was inevitable. If you have a political discourse in which on the one side the government is full of traitors and everyone who criticizes the government is a Russian agent, then you really have no room for discourse. We have a political system in which you do not have opponents and you have enemies. And that's what will lead to events of yesterday. And I'm not particularly worried about the events of yesterday. I'm worried about worse events to come, because this kind of polarizing language where there's no room to talk, where there's no room for nuance, will lead to greater political violence, which is the last thing that we need. What we need to do is to create a political system where all of the actors like themselves or actually love themselves more than they hate their enemies. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insight.
Чекист рожден в борьбе, мужал в сражениях жарких, с той пламенной поры немало лет прошло. Фуражку со звездой, потертую кожанку в музее положили под стекло. Но враг готовит нам опять огни и войны, и тучи тяжело нависли над землей. Советская страна пусть трудится спокойно, а нам, товарищ, рано на покой.